Now, we have two major wars that are coming up in this unit, World War I and World War II. The thing I want to emphasize, though, about World War I and II is I know that you guys love the World Wars, especially guys because they've played Call of Duty and they're like, I want to learn all about how Call of Duty is historically accurate, which it actually is pretty historically accurate. And there's also Battlefield. But here's the problem. There is so much to learn in the APUSH curriculum that there's not enough time to cover. It looked like you were assaulting him.
Anytime someone says AP US history, abbreviated.
Oh.
APUSH.
Okay. Oh, I get. Okay. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to break up a fight, and I'm 9 months pregnant. That's bad. So, anyways, as much as we love World War I and World War II, it is also, though, so much more in American history to teach. So while my core classes learn World War II in over a month and a half, we learn it in 2 days. Oh. And like with World War I, we're going to learn it in 1 day plus a little bit of next class. So if you're like huge into battles and things like that, that is awesome. Go research it on your own time. Because unfortunately, we have such a small amount. So if you were really looking forward to learning all about every single battle of each war, we're not going to cover it, unfortunately, but we're going to learn a ton. And I'm really excited about today because I have a ton of really cool videos and stuff like that and gross pictures, so it's going to be a great time. Yes. Okay. Although these ones you might not like because these aren't just like dead pictures. These are like really gross pictures. Anyways, so with World War I, one thing I want to emphasize about World War I is World War I is mostly an AP World or Euro class. So a lot of this information, we don't cover a lot of it in World War I because it's considered more of an AP World and things like that because we were only in the war for 2 years. Now, in terms of at the top of this, I would put a nice big star at the top of this paper. And the top of the chapter 20, I don't know why it says part 2, but okay, so starring this, and I would put imperialism / example of worldwide power. So if you remember when we talked about imperialism, remember that essay prompt is all about America becoming a worldwide power? This is just another example of America's imperialism as in going into other countries and having influence over them. Now, if you want to put next to imperialism and do like a little arrow and put historical context. If you get a World War I essay, all that we've learned about imperialism works as a great historical context. Now, we're going to briefly go over the causes of World War I. A lot of this is world stuff, which is why we're not going to emphasize it very much. But what I would do is I would highlight on each of these bullets, the first bullet, I would highlight the word militarism, then alliances, then imperialism, and nationalism. And the reason why is because if you notice, those letters, M-A-I-N, make up the main causes of World War I.
Yeah, that's good.
So it helps you to kind of trigger it and remember it a little bit, okay? So going through very quickly the causes of the war. So we're going to start with militarism. Militarism is the idea of having a bigger, better, badder military. Now, if you look at this chart right here, far left is in 1880. Far right is going to be in 1914, the start of the war. What happens to the military spending in each of these countries during this time?
It went way up.
It skyrockets, right? So people are now spending a ton of money on their military budget. In fact, when we hit our peak in the 1960s when we do the Cold War, we're spending almost 71% of our American budget on military spending. Right now we spend about 35 to 40%. But before, it was like 5%, maybe. Now people are massively increasing their spending. Now, in terms of alliance systems are one of the most important reasons of why they go to war. As you make these allies, you begin to kind of have a bit of an effect. So I want you to picture in your head for a second, okay? Because you would never do this because you're all great students. But I want you to imagine you're hanging out at lunch and some kid comes up and grabs like the Oreo cookies out of your hands and eats them.
Bro.
Okay? Not cool, right?
Not
So you go up to that person and you say, meet me at the flagpole at 3 p.m.
Wait, you took my Oreos.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty serious crime, so it's fighting time. So, okay, listen. So your two groups go out to the flagpole at 3 o'clock, and you and this other person who took your Oreos, you guys don't punch each other, you just lightly push each other because we're nice to each other, okay? Now, obviously, this other kid, though, pushes you a little too hard. And your friend in the back of you is like, whoa, I'm not going to stand for that. And so they go and they start pushing them. Well, then this Oreo stealer's friend comes in and says, no, you can't do that to my friend. And soon, after like 5 minutes, you got like a 30-person brawl all over Oreos. Okay? Now, this idea, which again, you're not going to do any, so don't get ideas to go out to the flagpole. Bad. Okay? But this idea is very similar to alliance systems in terms of what we call a domino effect. Let's pretend you're really good at dominoes and you set it up correctly. What's going to happen when you hit this first domino? They all fall down. So in this case, if one person goes to war, and in the next, and the next, and the next, and soon the entire world is at war, and you get a world war. The next one is imperialism. So we've talked about this before, grabbing new territories. Now, if you look at this map of Africa, so this is going to be the major colonies of it, and all these different countries have land grabs. When you have a bunch of people having land grabs, everyone begins to hate each other. So, for example, in this case, United Kingdom's going to say, well, why don't I have Cameroon? Or, well, we just found diamonds down here. Why can't I have that land? And people begin to have tension. The last one is nationalism, and I'm really excited because I have a meme. So I'm cool like you guys. Yeah, so if you don't find it funny, just kind of giggle so it makes me feel good. All right? So nationalism is the idea of being really, really proud of your country. Like this. Just read it. See, it's funny because it's Valentine's Day, and it relates. Thank you so much for that pity laugh, by the way. It made me feel really good. Now, in terms of nationalism, yes, I got it, yes. I feel so cool. Last class thought it was really dumb, so at least you guys faked it. Now, in terms of nationalism, it's the idea that when we talk about nationalism in America, it's like, yeah, America, flag, 4th of July. When we talk about nationalism, we talk about you are so into your country, you're willing to kill other people who don't like you. And so what happens is that all throughout Europe, people are like, I'm the biggest, baddest, I'm the biggest, baddest. Egos begin to rise. And as you know, when egos rise, not eagles, but egos rise, tensions begin to rise too.
I thought you were being like Brody first.
No, nobody can take that with Brody. I'm letting you know. Once he leaves, I don't know who's going to take it over. So all of this begins to cause this war. But of course, you're going to have what is known as the trigger point. And I would highlight his name, which is... No, Archduke Franz Ferdinand II. Now, it is highly unlikely, and again, I have really cool videos and gross photos, and you can't see those unless you're quiet. Okay? So, this, by the way, is highly unlikely to be on your exam, but it's going to help trigger your memory. If you see this guy's name, though, you're going to automatically know that you're talking about World War I. So here's basically what happens in a very shortened version. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand is from Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary has control over a smaller country called Serbia. Now the problem is Serbia is over being controlled by somebody else, and they decide that they are going to start kind of a civil war in an attempt to be able to break away from Austria-Hungary and be their own country. So the leader of Austria-Hungary, or one of the leaders, the Archduke, goes to Serbia and participates in a parade. While he's going down this parade route, well, if you wait for the story, it'll make more sense. So he's going down the street, streets are lined with people, and all of a sudden a bomb falls into his car. So what are you going to do? Pick up the bomb, throw it out the car, explodes into the crowd, 8 people die. Now he continues on in this parade. He rounds a corner, and 2 snipers on top of the roof from the Serbian rebels shoot down They miss him, kills a guard next to him. At this point, they decide probably should get off the parade route.
This parade is going nuts.
Yeah, it's a pretty crazy parade. Also starts a world war. So then they pull into a gas station. He walks into the gas station. When he walks in, two Serbian nationals who did not know that he was going to be there at the time, but they both have shotguns on them, see him, shoot him, and he gets killed.
7 pranks that went way too far.
Well, I wouldn't say they were pranks. I would say they were assassinations. Remember, World War I was really sad and people died, so let's just remind that. Now, what happens though is with their deaths is going to come this war. And if you remember back to our domino effect or our fight out at the flagpole, here's basically what happens. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Serbia, who's friends with Russia, Russia declares war on Austria for declaring war on Serbia. Then Germany, who's friends with Austria, declares war on Russia, who declares war on Austria, who declares war on Serbia. What's basically happening? Dominoes. All these different countries, 17 in the next 3 days, are all going to fall into place, declare war, and now you have a world war. Yeah?
Wait, so the guy was in Austria and that's where he got shot?
No, he was in Serbia.
So the Austria guy was in Serbia.
Yeah, because they controlled Serbia.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like our president going to Puerto Rico. They still control the country, but it's an independent country. But Serbia didn't want to be controlled.
It was more of an empire, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, the Austria-Hungary Empire took up about a third of Europe and parts of Asia.
Wasn't it Bosnia? And then, because Serbia was independent, but Bosnia was controlled by Austria-Hungary, wasn't it?
It's this whole area. So Serbia wants to become the new Austria-Hungary, basically, in all this.
Well, yeah.
But the Bosnian rebels, so the Bosnian rebels were part of this whole plot as well. Yeah. Okay, so World War I now begins. And obviously some of you are a little bored because you're on your cell phone, so just put that away, please. Okay? Now, on this next section, new forms of warfare, if you will please star this. This is an important concept with World War I. Warfare is going to completely change during World War I. And one of the main things, if you will highlight, is trench warfare.
Ooh, like in Wonder Woman.
So actually, Wonder Woman is actually set in World War I. It actually is a lot more historical than you might think, because it all has to do with the first airplanes being in war, and then it also talks about the chemical gas.
Yeah.
And then if you will also highlight the machine gun. Now, here's basically what happens. You have a brand new form of warfare with the machine gun. Now, prior to this, we did have some types of handheld machine guns. Could shoot maybe 30, 50 rounds in about 2 to 3 minutes.
That's really slow.
I know, which is why they created the machine gun. And so what happens is now they have this machine gun where now you have this belt with hundreds of bullets. It feeds through the barrel with like 30 possible bullets in it. And it just shoots out at a rate that now 100 bullets can be shot in about 30 seconds. The problem with this is it changes warfare. Think all the way back to when we learned about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. Remember when we watched that film with Pickett's Charge, and they like all got in a line, and they're like march, and they all marched together in this line, and they had a guy at the front leading them.
Where they're charging.
Yes, and they're charging, and then they all die.
And all the
Now,
bullets are firing at them, and they're kind of missing.
yeah, yep.
Right, that's what happens.
Yeah, that's what happens. Now, the thing about this war, though, is this is what changes that. You can no longer have this chivalrous get-together, beat the drums, sound the horn, charge. You can't do that anymore. Instead, the machine gun is going to change everything. Now, we're about to watch a clip from an incredible movie. It's PG-13, ask your parents' permission.
What is it?
It's going to be the movie War Horse. Now, War Horse, if you love animals, make sure that you have a bunch of tissues because it is very, very sad. But it's a great film, and this film basically revolves around this law that was passed in the UK in the World Wars because they believed in the cavalry. Now, the cavalry is something that was always, it was basically the Navy SEALs of the British Army. The best people were in the cavalry. Well, when they were running out of horses, they had a law that said any horse under the age of 10 must be given to the UK government for use in the war. So basically the movie is all about this horse and its journey through World War I. So what you're going to see in this clip that we're about to see is I want you to think, how does warfare change because of the invention of the machine gun? Okay? So we're going to watch this clip. And again, what is the impact of the machine gun? Yeah. You have to give me one of yours. Have to give me one of yours.
I didn't get any of the third quarter.
Oh, it's because you were gone that day. Okay, I'll get you some after class, but you need to sign out, and now you have to take one of yours. Okay, listen. So again, what impacts this happen? By the way, you will see several very famous people in this clip, because it's a Steven Spielberg movie.
Whoa.
Okay, okay. You can be a little bit calmer, guys.
Good luck, my friends.
Guys, it's sad. He's sad.
Loki died too.
Or is he dead? Okay. Now, who can raise their hand and tell me what impact the machine gun had on warfare? How did warfare change? Okay. Who has another possible answer to this? Pablo?
It was just an easier way to kill everyone.
Yeah, so can you do the old school way of like being chivalrous and mounting your horse and then going forward and then going forward again? Can you do that anymore?
No.
No, because now it's just a bloody massacre. And this is really when warfare changes, is with the invention of this machine gun. Now, following the invention of the machine gun, we now have a new form of warfare where people are constantly shooting at each other with rather accurate guns. So now we have to start what is known as trench warfare. Yeah.
So, which countries were the first ones that had the machine gun?
Germany. Germany is the first ones. So we find this out in the very first battles of the war. There were other handhelds, not really machine guns, but rapid feed belts across the world, but nothing in comparison to this. And then when Germany starts to premiere it in the first couple of battles, immediately the other allies go to and pretty much use spies to steal the plans and things like that. And within about a year, everybody has the machine gun. Yeah. So what happens, though, is that now we have trench warfare. So basically this involves digging deep trenches where you can be able to sit there and you can be able to shoot at each other from across a long ways away. Now, are trenches mobile? No. So now what does this become? A defensive war, where you sit there for months and months and months at a time. There was one battle that becomes one of the turning points of the war, where over 6 months they progressed 50 yards into enemy territory, because you don't move these. And over here on the left is what's known as no man's land. Across that you have mortar shells, artillery shells, things like that going off. Why is it called no man's land? Who goes in that area? No man. Because you're going to get shot and killed. Now, but they die. Now, the one thing about this, though, is that this is also terrible, awful conditions. Because of all the bombs going off, all the vegetation is gone. And because of that, it becomes a wet, yucky mess for 4 full years. And the problem with this is that when you're sitting in those trenches for months and months and months, and you're having it bogged down like this, there's no place for you to really sit or anything like that, and it's cold and it's wet, so you're not going to change any of your clothes for typically 9 months.
Ooh.
Yeah.
What are people fighting over?
Well, so in this case, it's a really complicated question. So in terms of in this case what they're fighting for, it's gaining of land. If you gain the enemy's land, you therefore take them over. In terms of ideology, it's a lot of things. It's little countries wanting to become bigger countries. It's superiority over one another. It's trying to help out the little guy of Serbia, saying, well, Serbia, Bosnia, countries like that need help to get out of these really big empires. That's what they're fighting for. Okay? So here's the problem, though. When you sit in there and you're not changing your clothes or your boots for 8-9 months, something really bad's going to happen, and that is what is known as trench foot. Now, what happens is that you're going to wear your boots typically 8 to 9 months. You don't take them off, because if you take them off, you're going to get frostbite, you're going to get in the mud, and that's really dangerous. The problem, though, is that when your foot is in that kind of an environment for 8 to 9 months, your skin begins to change. Now, I'm giving you a warning. If you have a foot thing, which I had a roommate that had a really bad foot phobia, and so they're totally legitimate, and I totally understand. Or if you have a problem with grossness, I'm going to start with a very mild and get way worse. Okay? So, imagine yourself swimming. And you stay in that pool for an hour. What happens to your skin?
It's all wrinkly.
It gets all wrinkly. So again, if this is too much for you, I would highly suggest looking away. No, guys, there are legitimate people with phobias. Trust me, I've lived with them. Okay? So, what happens is your foot begins to crinkle because basically the pores in your skin takes on water, begins to get heavy, and it causes the wrinkles. Well, here's the problem. When you have this, or let's say you go on a hike and you accidentally step in a puddle, you have to take off your socks, you let your feet dry out for a couple hours, your socks dry out, you're fine. You're not doing that in this case because you're in the same spot for 8 to 9 months, and you're not taking off your boots, your socks, nothing like that. So slowly, with all this water getting into your foot, all that cold water begins to basically take your veins and begins to shrink them. Then all of a sudden, blood is cut off from your foot. So your nerve endings start feeling anything. And you don't realize this is happening. Your feet go numb without you even realizing it. And so all of a sudden, after multiple months, you go home, you take off your boots, and again, warning, 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 okay? And your foot has trench foot. So this is basically when so much blood has been cut off from your feet and all those nerve endings are gone, and your foot quite literally dies off. Now this can start mild. So this is a mild version of trench foot, where basically if you notice this has only affected the first several layers of skin, so it basically will peel off. This would be a good case scenario. Instead, what a lot of people have happen to them is they begin to get severe trench foot. These are feet that have basically at this point none of their toes. They're all black because they basically don't exist anymore. This is when you get your feet amputated or your toes amputated. But there is some good news. You see, all this dead skin attracts somebody because it attracts rats. Because rats can eat through anything. And your boots are terrible boots because the army doesn't have a lot of money. So at night, after all your nerve endings are dead, all the rats start to bite through your boots. And then they find your dead feet. And if you look at this picture right here, you can actually see it because it actually only has one toe left. As they begin to eat away all that dead skin. And what happens is that the army actually creates, through genetics, a rat terrier. And if you might say why they're called a rat terrier, is because their job was to go in and out of all the trenches and capture all the rats, trying to get rid of them in the trench foot. They, on average, typically would catch anywhere between 300 and 400 rats per day in the trenches. Yeah.
That's a lot of rats.
Now, in terms of other terrible things about this war, the next thing that's going to happen is the first use of chemical warfare. Now, this is Germany.
Not cool.
Yeah, well, we're going to learn about why it's not cool. So Germany begins to use the wind and begins to use this to spread their chemical gas. Now, what happens with this chemical gas? Well, there's 4 major gases used in the First War. If you're lucky, you only get tear gas. This is used at the very beginning, their first attempt at warfare. Now, if you get sprayed with pepper spray is usually maybe 10% pepper. That's it. You get really uncomfortable, they would spray it into the trenches, you would leave, take over the trench, blah, blah, blah. But as time goes on, they then invent chlorine and phosgene gas. Let me explain what both of them do. Chlorine gas, you begin to inhale. Imagine a nice big balloon. Imagine squeezing that balloon all the way until it looks just like a little raisin. That's what happens to your lungs. When you bring in the chlorine gas, your lungs literally suffocate themselves, where it closes in on itself, squeezes all the air out, doesn't allow anything in. Are you just paying attention to this?
Yeah.
Okay. So then you have phosgene gas. Phosgene does the exact opposite. Instead of constricting, it begins to basically expand in your lungs until they eventually explode and you die. Now, mustard gas isn't as bad. Only 2% of people die from mustard gas. But you're going to feel like you want to die. Because what happens with mustard gas is when you breathe it in or it comes into contact with your skin, you get welts all over the outside of your body that don't go away for the rest of your life. No. But that's not the problem. The problem is when you breathe it in and your lungs fill with this air, what do your lungs now get?
Get welts.
Get welts. Ooh. So imagine for the rest of your life, you're a 19-year-old recruit, and for the rest of your life, you can only breathe about 50% of the oxygen into you because everything else in your lungs is welts. So for the rest of your life, you are wheezing and out of breath for the next 50, 60 years. Yeah?
Mustard gas can also melt your eyes.
Can also melt your eyes, yep. So that's why we start getting like the gas masks and things like that, which also have the eyes. Good job. Now, this obviously causes a mass destruction, and really, World War I becomes known for this awful, terrible amounts of death going on. Now, fun fact about this is that in America, and this is kind of skipping ahead a little bit, once America gets into the war, they actually discover that if you took prunes and you mashed them up and put them into the gas mask, it would block all this gas from getting through. So Americans begin to make prunes in massive amounts to send them to the war effort, and that's why we have things like prune juice. So if your grandparents like that, it's partially because of World War I, because we made it in massive amounts.
Yeah.
Now, the next one, which I'm throwing in there because I have a really cool video about it. So these are the flamethrowers. Now, when you are a flamethrower, you have one of the dangerous jobs. The first thing you do is you destroy all of no man's land because it's easier to see your target. But the next thing that you also do is you actually go into the trenches, and then in each of those trenches, you actually put the flamethrower in, set it on fire to be able to get those people out. Now, I have a video I'm going to show you about the flamethrowers. Basically what happened is that these guys in England recreated a World War I era flamethrower. By the way, they do use pure gasoline, which is extremely, it was a good idea when you're trying to set something on fire. So we're going to watch this clip, and I want you to imagine you're an American sitting in the trench, and this is coming at you.
Livins added diesel to his fuel mix.
The diesel's in to give it extra thickness and carry, and also to make sure it stays alight when it reaches the German trenches. So some of it's alight as it's going over there. It lands in the trenches, and then it catches fire, so whoever's in the trenches.
If they succeed in igniting this mixture of diesel and kerosene, the effect will be as close to the original weapon as we can possibly get.
Okay, Tom, keep it going, you all.
So imagine that coming at you, right? So it's a huge fear tactic. It depends. It depends. If the portable ones are about a quarter of that, but what happens in 1916 is they convert from using handheld ones with the backpacks, and they begin to actually sneak large tanks over into the trenches, and they begin to use this system instead in 1916. Did you have something to say? Oh, okay. Now, one interesting thing as well, and this is not going to be on the AP exam, but it's an incredibly fun fact.
Cool.
Who is this?
Darth Vader.
Darth Vader. What TV show or movie is he from? Star Wars. Well, if you don't know, his name is German. It means father in German. Like, okay.
I thought Vader was father.
They're two different forms of father. So Vader is the formal, and then Darth is the informal. So actually in Germany they have like 6 or 7 different ways. Okay. His name means father. Okay, so listen. So here's the thing about this. What is his minions' names? Stormtroopers. World War I, there were also stormtroopers. Okay, now I want you to watch this. Look at his hat.
Helmet.
Okay, ready for the stormtroopers?
Yeah, samurai helmet.
What are you noticing? They're the exact same. And the reason why is because the stormtroopers in World War I were the front lines. They were basically our Navy SEALs. They were the first ones to go in, and they were also the first ones to do the flamethrowers. There's all these really great books about the symbolism of Star Wars. The vast majority of Star Wars in the first 3 movies, as in 4, 5, and 6, all have symbolism all about World War I and World War II against Germany. Okay? Now, it isn't all bad, because there is some positives, and one of them has to do with Christmas. So in 1914, an event is going to happen during World War I having to do with Christmas. And, yes, there is a book. And we're going to watch a commercial all about that event. And by the way, is this supposed to convince you to buy something? So we'll see if you can figure out what you're supposed to buy from this commercial. Okay. So...
name is Jim.
Mein Name ist Otto.
Pleased to meet you, Otto.
Freut mich.
Rose, she's called.
It's schön, schön.
Happy Christmas. Frohe Weihnachten.
You're all going to buy a ton of chocolate from that, right?
Oh, I thought it was for grandpa.
No, it is for chocolate. It did actually work. They say they sold about $20 million more chocolate that year than they had in any previous year because of this ad. But anyways, off the chocolate. So this really was a real event. It is what's called the Christmas Tree Truce. Basically what happened is the very first Christmas of the war, 1914, they decided on a 3-day ceasefire. Just like in the show that you guys saw, they get together, they play soccer, just as you guys saw in this. However, didn't have as great of an ending as it might imply in this. In fact, 3 days after, this was kind of like a secret thing. It wasn't exactly like it was commanded by the heads. And so what ends up happening is that the commanders all get sanctioned. They get removed from their posts for doing this. They said it was anti-war. Some of the German commanders actually were executed because they decided to do this truce. It never happens again in the war. So a good thing, a positive thing, a happy thing, but it does end in 1914. Now we're going to get into actually America's involvement into the war. So if you'll put a line above this section of your notes, and if you will put underneath this line, study below this. This is the most likely of what's going to be on your AP exam involving America going towards war. Now, in this war, the leader of the United States is going to be Woodrow Wilson. If you'll go ahead and highlight him. If you ever see Woodrow Wilson, 99% of the time it is a World War I question. Now, when the war begins, we declare neutrality. So if you will highlight above where it says America declares, I will go ahead and highlight neutrality. We start with neutrality, which basically means we're not participating. We're not saying that we are isolation. We're not saying we're not going to trade. We're just saying it's not our problem. It's over there in Europe. Now, as time goes on, though, things begin to change. And it starts because of these German, what's called a U-boat. Up where it says new forms of warfare, if you will highlight the word U-boat, U-boat is a name for a German submarine, and they were good. They could sneak up on anybody they wanted to. They were great in the seas, and they were able to destroy all these different people. Well, what happens is they create a blockade around England. And starting in, I believe it was 1916, as time goes on, there's a ship, which imagine is a passenger ship, because remember they don't have planes, which is called the Lusitania. And if you will highlight this, Lusitania. 1915, excuse me. So what happens is that this passenger liner is transporting about 2,500 people from New York City to Ireland. As he approaches Irish waters, he knows, as the captain, that there's going to be U-boats. So typically their strategy was to go very close to the shore, sail on the coastline where submarines can't go into that shallow of water. The problem is it was extremely foggy that day. He couldn't see how far the shore was. He couldn't see the lighthouses, so he couldn't go close to shore because he could hit the rocks. So instead, he goes further away and heads straight into U-boat territory. While he's in this territory, he decides to increase his speed, thinking this will get him through the U-boat territory faster. Unfortunately, what this does is he ends up matching the speed that the average torpedo can be shot at. And because of that, it causes it to be a perfect situation where they can be able to bomb it. So the German U-boats send out their torpedo, bombs the Lusitania, and about 1,500 people are going to die, about 500 of them Americans. Now the world is enraged. Now Germany is not even attacking our military, they're killing our innocent civilians. And what happens is that people have this as a call to arms. These are people that did nothing wrong, and all of a sudden, they're getting killed because of these terrible Germans. And Americans begin to shift towards war. Except there's a little problem. You see, remember how I said those people were innocent civilians? Well, I wasn't lying about that. But the ship wasn't as innocent as you might think. You see, America, remember, is neutral, right? We're not in the war. Well, turns out that in the bottom of the Lusitania, America had done some shipments, which is really common. People will ship things back and forth in cargo holds during this time, think the Titanic. Well, in these shipments just happened to be thousands of guns, bombs, and ammunition to help England win the war. So while we were neutral, we were secretly sending bombs back and forth to England using these. Imagine if you're like on your cool Disney cruise, and it turns out there's like 5 nuclear bombs in the hull being transported back and forth to secret places.
That sounds like a movie plot.
Well, it did happen in real life because it was the Lusitania. So yeah, real movie. So what happens is that basically the Lusitania does not get bombed because it's a passenger ship. The Lusitania gets bombed because it contains all this ammunition.
Well, how did the Germans know that?
Because the Germans had decoded a whole bunch of our secret military transmissions between us and England. So this actually, by the way, does not come out until after the war. Germany did know. America knew Germany knew afterwards, but it doesn't come out to the public until after the war. So instead, Americans have this as a rallying cry. We must defend and go into this war because of Lusitania, because of all those innocent people killed with no just cause. Well, then we begin to prepare. Wilson declares a thing called the Preparedness Program, where we're not going to go to war, but we're just going to be prepared for war. But I promise we're not going to go to war. Okay? He then wins re-election. If you will highlight his slogan, which was, he kept us out of war. So Wilson wins the presidency under the slogan, we're not in war. And I promise you, we're not going to go to war. Except something is going to completely change that, and this is going to be the trigger point for America. If you will highlight the Zimmerman note, and then star that, because this ends up becoming our major trigger point of entering the war. So here's basically what happens. Germany sends a telegram to Mexico. You're like, okay, that's weird. Why is Germany sending that? That's not their ally. But it's kind of like one of those things, like, so imagine you're texting something really, really bad about your friend to another friend, and you hit send, and then you realize you sent it to the friend you were talking smack about.
Oh, sure.
That's what happens here. Instead of sending it to Mexico, the transmission gets intercepted by a British military officer, that's Zimmerman. He then takes this information, he sells the information to an American newspaper, and it gets published. And here's basically what the note says. The note says, from Germany to Mexico, if you agree to allow us to secretly come into Mexico, set up military bases, and then invade America from the south, once we win the war, you regain everything you lost in the Mexican cession. That's about 1/3 to 1/2 of the American land. So what you need to highlight on your paper is, if you will highlight sent to Mexico by Germany, and then the Mexican cession. Now, in today's world, imagine if it comes out in the news tomorrow that up on the border of Canada and Idaho is 15 nuclear bombs that North Korea gave to Canada to bomb us. That's how severe this is. People are a sudden scared. Are we going into war? Is this the end? Are we all going to die? Are they invading us tomorrow? We don't know. And what happens is America pushes towards war, and then America declares war on Germany. So this becomes our trigger point. So if you want to maybe write next to that, this is America's trigger point, if you want to do like an arrow, of us going into the war. Now, when we go into the war, we enter a period that's known as total warfare. And if you will highlight total warfare, or total war, excuse me. Total war is the idea that anybody and everybody is invested at all times into this war. So like, for example, right now, we have people fighting all over the world, especially in the Middle East. Now, some of you might be an exception to that, especially if your family's in the military. But right now, are we 100% totally ingrained in fighting that's happening in the Middle East right now? No. Does every second of your lives revolve around Middle Eastern fighting? No. Total warfare is when quite literally everything is going to be centered around the war. Now the effect, and by the way, the war of attrition, if you want to do like a little arrow from total war to war of attrition is the fancy name for total warfare. It basically means that Germany attempted to what's called bleed France white, which is basically where they attempted to be so terrible to them that they would eventually surrender and just kill them all. So what happens is that Germany's doing this total warfare, but if you star the second or the last bullet following that one, when America joins the war, the biggest impact is that following America's involvement, you can no longer have a war of attrition. Because you have so many other people you're worried about, you can't just kill everybody and have people surrender. It now becomes much harder for Germany to be able to win. So what are some examples of total warfare in America? If you will triple star this section that says home front of World War I. In most likelihood, there are 3 possible LEQs, in my opinion, that you could see on the AP exam about World War I. The first LEQ is about the home front. And this was the LEQ back in, I think it was 2003. So we're going to go through a couple of examples of how America became this warfare of total war. So, for example, if you will highlight where it says poster war. America begins to use propaganda to get people to do what they want them to think. So we begin this massive poster campaign in the United States to convince people to join and support the war effort. Now, the next thing we have is what is called as a war bond. Now, if you will highlight, by the way, war bond, that's something that you need to know for both World War I and World War II. Now, we don't do this anymore. But here's basically what a war bond was. At this point, we don't have mass national debt. Part of the reason why we're able to spend so much on the military nowadays is because we can go into national debt. Now, back then, though, you have to pay for that in cash. America doesn't have enough cash. So here's basically what they say. If you go to the post office, you can buy this stamp. It's not a letter stamp, but this stamp that is known as a war bond. So if you pay $10 for this, you get this little stamp. That $10 immediately goes to the national government and pays for the war. Now, the whole point of this, though, is because why it's called a bond or a loan is because after the war, they give you that $10 back plus interest. So basically, you're investing in the government to go to war, and then once the war is over, you get that money back. So what happens is that basically Americans fund the war through these war bonds. Now, the next thing is going to be called the Selective Service Act, which if you will highlight on here, that is the draft. Highlight on here that this is the draft. Conscription is a fancy word for the draft. So starting at 18 years old, 18 to 26, is that you are now signed up for the draft. What that means is that you are able to be drafted and put into the war at any time. Now, whenever somebody has a draft and they institute a draft, that's usually when you go into total warfare, because now people's lives are changing because of this act. Now, in today's world, all boys between 18 and 26, they did pass a law that said girls had to do it, and then it got stopped with the new administration coming in. But guys do have to sign up for the draft. It is against the law to not sign up for the draft unless you're not a legal citizen of the United States. In theory, fingers crossed, the only way a draft would ever be instituted is if they literally eliminated like 90% of our army because we have such a big army now. In theory, okay? But regardless, though, you go to register for the draft. And then you get what's called a doughboy. And I picked this picture because it had puppies in it. Now, basically what a doughboy is this is kind of, if you want to put next to doughboy, this is and by the way, I believe it's on the back. So the doughboys, if you want to put next to doughboys, this is a negative effect of total warfare. What happens is that basically, when you go into war, you were promised you're going to get 6 months of training here in the United States, 2 months of training overseas, and then you go off to war. Problem is, when America goes into the war, they realize they need a lot more people than they expected. So as time goes on and you get drafted at 18, 19 years old, instead of receiving 8 months of training to go off to war, you stay in the United States for 2 days. They give you a gun. And they say, all right, go to the front lines. So you have all these 18, 19-year-old boys going to the front lines with zero training. And the doughboys, the reason why it's that negative one is because the doughboys are going to account for the most amounts of deaths in the war because they haven't been properly trained. A lot of them had never shot a gun until they were on the front lines. And so what happens is that these doughboys become that negative impact of just sending a ton of people over to go and fight this war.
Why are they called doughboys?
And I read this today. The term originates actually in England. And if I remember correctly, it had something to do with the fact that it was just the normal person, like the average baker kind of a kid, that went off to war. But anyways, so the next one, though, is what's called work or fight. And here's basically what happens. America comes out with this law that says that you either work in a war industry or you go off and fight in the war. And basically what this is trying to encourage is wartime production. So if you look on the picture on the right, imagine if this was like your guilt sitting in front of you. God help me if this is a dud. His life is in your hands. If you actually screw up one thing on this grenade, you've just killed this guy, right? So the idea is basically creating these munitions for the war. Well, the thing about this work or fight is if you were in a non-important, non-wartime role, your job was eliminated. So let me give you an example. Let's talk about baseball. Is baseball necessary to win a war against Europe? No, right? And yet baseball at this time is America's pastime, much larger than football. Well, what happens is that all the players in the league, when the war starts, it's kind of unsure. We're going to keep playing because that's like a nationalist. It's kind of like this idea of America, the spirit. It's a very much an emotional home front thing. Well, what happens, though, is as time goes on, they know that they're at risk of being shut down. This work or fight thing comes out, and they start to declare that baseball's not important. Now, they try to integrate it. So you can actually see right here, they ran drills with guns. They also kind of did like a comedy thing where they would actually run drills with baseball bats, pretending that they were guns, in an attempt to show that these were important, that people could still go. Then they are then ordered to no longer have baseball. They end up having the World Series 7 months early. And then they disband the National Baseball League, and they're either sent to the front lines or they're sent to go work in ammunition factories. They begin to eliminate these unimportant positions.
Do you think that because they disbanded the baseball, it's not as popular as it is today?
No. I think that's a lot of... baseball was the thing, really, until, in my opinion, when television starts to come out. And when television starts to come out and football begins to increase more and more and more, because really football becomes a big thing starting in the 60s. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of people came home from World War II, and a lot of people were able to kind of release themselves in a more aggressive manner through football, whereas baseball is not as aggressive. And so more and more guys began to join, and more guys began to play after World War II, and it just became a bigger thing. Now, another thing they did, too, is if you will highlight, this is back on the front page, is they did rationing. Now, the goal of this was basically to be able to save food and things like that for people over in the war. You eat less meat here, you send it off to the men at war, and you'll be good to go. Now, women. This one is important, so if you will star the women's section. So what happens with women is that women are going to begin to break that cult of domesticity. So this is really important for the women's rights movements. At first they're told, just go buy war bonds. Just go buy liberty bonds. That's the same thing. Well, as time begins to go on, now that all the men are at war, they are now needed to do something else, and they begin to work in the factories. And they begin to have these manual, typically male-dominated jobs that they can then begin to break away from the cult of domesticity. Okay, and then the last one that they do as well is the Victory Gardens, which are much more popular in World War II than World War I. Oh, Nate, sorry. This is in Spanish, so I don't. Okay, so anyways, the Victory Gardens are basically encouraging you to grow things at home instead of having to rely on the supermarkets that can then send those food over to the men at war. Okay? Will you please grab out your assignment that you picked up today? Now, we're kind of going to have to, we're like 5 minutes behind, so we didn't get to the third document. Okay, so for right now, if you will just circle document 1 and document 2. Basically, what your job is you are going to analyze these documents, and then if you flip this paper over, basically you're going to pretend, if you look at the top underneath where it says DBQ analysis, you'll see like an essay question that says, what are the effects of World War I on America? You're going to pretend that that's your essay question, and you're basically going to write DBQ paragraphs. So, topic sentence, if you will box where it has the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, that's what you're responsible to do. So, one effect of America's involvement in the war was rationing. And then the next one is define and explain, and then you do a HIP analysis on each. Now, you only need to do the first 2 by next Friday. So, first 2 done by next Friday. Because the other 2, the first 2 boxes, because the other 2 documents you won't know. Okay? Well, okay. There's 2 things. There's the essay. This is the DBQ. The only reason it's due next Friday for you guys is simply because you don't have class with me until Friday. Okay? Only do the first 2. And if you need to use a separate piece of paper, you can use a separate piece of paper. Okay?
Don't we have class on Thursday?
Not for mine. You have A Day on Thursday.
So there's A.